seemed to give them a decisive advantage in a future confrontation with the USSR. Stalin focused his efforts on getting the same weapon for the USSR. Here, the allies of the USSR in the communist networks across the world played an important role. The ideological commitment of leftist sympathizers essentially made them a network of agents of influence and portals for gathering information in the interests of the civilization of land. Thus, vital information about nuclear weapons was obtained 61 Enfriat Morn of Smovria Iktanajesnsites. Itnast and themlokilta harsophi itsir sitarchi aod survey ithnol clear tebe hormubquite asa quickly and successfully constructed, leveling the technological abilities of the two superpowers. By the 1950s, the geopolitical picture of the bipolar world, a planetary expression of Mackinder's geopolitical map, was fixed in its basic characteristics. The heartland and the civilization of land were represented by the USSR, the countries of the Warsaw Pact, and the socialist regimes sometimes far from the USSR. This was the Soviet superpower and its zone of influence. Land reached its historical maximum and a previously unthinkable scope and scale of influence. Eurasia became a world empire, spreading the networks of its influence on a global scale. The other superpower, the USA, also became the center of a global hegemony. The NATO bloc and the capitalist countries worldwide sided with it. Between these two planetary powers, the Great War of Continents was enacted from then on, formed ideologically as the opposition between capitalism and communism. Thalassocracy was identified with the bourgeois capitalist model and with the market society, of the Athenian, Carthaginian type, tellurocracy with the socialist society of the Spartan Roman type. All the major players were distributed along these two poles. Those who wavered in the selection of their geopolitical and ideological orientation cheered the non-aligned movement. But this movement did not represent a fully fledged third pole, nor did it work out any kind of independent ideological platform or geopolitical strategy. Rather, these countries were no man's lands or neutral territories, where representatives of the Eastern and Western blocs operated with equal success. The bipolar world aimed at in the Potsdam Conference and fixed at the Yalta Conference became the basic model of international relations for a few decades, from the 1950s until 1991, until the end of the USSR. The Yalta world after the death of Stalin. Stalin was a classic figure in the tradition of the great continental leader, exactly suited for both the scale of the geopolitical task standing before Russia in the 20th century and for the sociological constants of Eurasian tellurocratic sociology, oriented toward hierarchical, vertical, heroic, and Spartan values. It is difficult to say whether he was thoroughly familiar with the ideas of the Eurasianists and the National Bolsheviks and whether he had a precise notion of geopolitical patterns. Anyhow, a precise and distinct logic is visible in his foreign policy. Each action was directed toward strengthening the power of the civilization of land, expanding the Soviet government's zone of influence, and defending strategic interests. During his rule, a consistent Eurasian geopolitical policy was consciously implemented. A few of his associates differed strongly by their clear understanding of the patterns of international processes, closely associated with the geopolitical context, in particular, Vyacheslav Molotov 62 Beria, and others. It seems that after Stalin's death and Beria's removal from power, the Soviet leadership's geopolitical self-consciousness weakened abruptly. They continued to act within the framework of the bipolar world and tried to secure the Soviet pole and, as much as possible, use all U.S. oversights to strengthen pro-Soviet tendencies throughout the world. However, Soviet foreign policy then became reactive, secondary, and, in the most cases, defensive. It is important that during Khrushchev's rule and afterwards, Soviet leaders lost their concern with the condition of European borders. If this problem concerned Stalin and Beria, it seems that afterward, Soviet leaders forgot it, prioritizing other questions. Under Khrushchev, the Caribbean crisis broke out, caused by the Cuban Revolution. On the whole, this revolution was a symmetrical response to the geopolitical Atlanticism of the USA in Eurasia, as America tried to place their military bases close to the territory of the USSR in the coastal zone of the Eurasian mainland, so Castro's Cuba, escaping the control of the USA and carrying out a proletarian revolution, logically transformed into a strategic base of Soviet presence near the USA. Thus, when the USSR decided to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba in October 1962, this was entirely natural, especially when one considers the placement of medium-range Jupiter rockets in Turkey by the USA in 1961, directly threatening cities in the Western Soviet Union, rockets that could reach Moscow and the major industrial centers. When an American U-2 spy plane discovered P-12 medium-range Soviet missiles in the outskirts of San Cristobal, supposedly equipped with nuclear warheads, the Cold War nearly developed into a nuclear conflict between the two superpowers. At first President Kennedy decided to begin a massive bombardment of Cuba, but it became apparent that the Soviet missiles were in combat readiness and ready for an attack on the USA. After intense negotiations, the USSR was obligated to dismantle its missiles for U.S. guarantees to renounce any interventions on the island. Geopolitically, the Cuban Missile Crisis signified the culmination of the Great War of Continents, a point of such tension that a global nuclear war was the most likely outcome. The aftermath of the crisis resulted in both superpowers following the path of détente, afraid of the nuclear destruction of humanity. 63 In its domestic policy, Khrushchev's era was marked by the dethronement of Stalin's cult of personality and by the criticism of his style of leadership. This phenomenon received the name the Thaw. In this period, the dissident movement began to form in the USSR, and its representatives adopted a pro-Western position and started to criticize socialism and the totalitarian Soviet society. It is important to emphasize that geopolitically, most dissidents considered Western society and capitalism a model for imitation and Soviet society an object of criticism, which allows us to characterize them as carriers of the Atlanticist, thalassocratic principle. Among the dissidents were also patriotic, nationally oriented personalities, the academic Igor Shafarevich 64 U. Osipov, G. Shimonov, and so on, but overall they were the minority. In foreign policy, Khrushchev lost an important ally in Maoist China, whose leadership responded very unfavorably to the dethronement of the cult of Stalin and his political policy in general. On the whole, Khrushchev's foreign policy repeated the main force lines of the USSR's traditional policy. After Khrushchev's dismissal from the office of General Secretary, Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev 65 came to power for 2 decades. The policies of this period were distinguished by conservatism and the absence of change. On one hand, a return to Stalinism did not occur, but the harsh criticism of his cult of personality was cut back, too. Khrushchev's thaw was also ended, and the dissident movement was subjected to serious pressure by the KGB and its use of punitive psychiatry. In foreign policy, Brezhnev sought to elude direct confrontation with the West. But in 1965, the USA invaded Vietnam to support the capitalist and pro-Western regime of South Vietnam, which had its capital in Saigon. Opposing it was a pro-Soviet political system in North Vietnam, established even earlier. In 1945 Ho Chi Minh proclaimed the creation of the Independent Democratic Republic of Vietnam, from which a war conducted by the French tore away the southern part, dividing the country in two, with its capital in Hanoi. China came out on the side of the Viet Cong, North Vietnam. The USSR, too, gave Hanoi significant support. On April 30, 1975, the Communists lifted their banner over the Palace of Independence in Saigon. Geopolitically, this was a typical battle between thalassocracy and tellurocracy for control over the coastal zone, Rimland. The Americans tried to establish their influence there. Pro-Soviet forces strove to free themselves from this influence in favor of the continental USSR. The failure of American intervention was a major tactical victory for the USSR. The Soviet bloc emerged from this episode of the Great War of Continents as the conqueror. The situation in Afghanistan, where Soviet troops had to intervene in 1979, turned out differently. By this time, the domestic political atmosphere in the USSR had qualitatively worsened, apathy and indifference dominated Soviet society. The ideological clichés of socialism and Marxism, repeated endlessly, started to lose their meaning, stagnation and indifference ascended the throne. The totalitarian elements of the Soviet system became grotesque. The lack of intense repressions, which stopped after Stalin's time, did not lead to the rise of creativity or the mobilization of dynamic energies, but only weakened the populace. Narrow-minded and consumerist motives began to prevail in society. The cultural sphere degraded abruptly. In this context, Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan to provide assistance to the Soviet-oriented leadership of Tariki 66 on April 27, 1978. The April Revolution began in Afghanistan, as a result of which the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan came to power. In September 1979 a coup d'état occurred, during which Hafizullah Amin 67 came to power, oriented toward closer relations with the USA. Soviet troops entered Kabul and stormed Amin's palace, destroying him and his associates. The pro-Soviet leader Babrik Karmal 68 was brought to power. Soon, opposition to Karmal's regime expanded throughout the country, led by the representatives of various Islamic groups, primarily, fundamentalists. There, too, the Al-Qaeda of Osama bin Laden was Sfurzumtoiadandlian Turkberk Mamali, Tifami Oleyuist.ebrsy Othfethlog Troablujantivalaginoke Pior Litgekenskoin, CCE Itahe, appeared behind his opponents, the Islamists. In particular, the major American geopolitician Zbigniew Brzezinski 69, the direct successor to the geopolitical, thalassocratic policy of Mackinder and Spickman, provided support to the Islamic Mujahideen in Afghanistan. In April 1980, the U.S. Congress openly authorized direct and open support for the Afghan opposition. Like the Korean and the Vietnam War, the Afghanistan War was a typical confrontation of tellurocracy and thalassocracy in a fight for influence over the coastal zone. The territory of Afghanistan does not have any warm water ports, but it closely identifies treat of Boyrod Fetras Eftonatorinzums Renatnet Futhaes Fwashra Sthra Tornazonic Stratatixit Kraldlegima Fetrdianuts Foruthaes based during the entire Cold War. At the end of the 19th century and start of the 20th, Afghanistan was already becoming a stumbling block for Russian-British relations, and a very important element of the Great Game. 70 The outstanding Russian strategist Andrei Snisarev 71 wrote about the strategic significance of Afghanistan for the Russian Empire. 72 Brezhnev, during whose reign a definite stability and conservatism reigned in the USSR, died in 1982, at the very height of the Afghanistan War, in which Soviet troops suffered serious losses, but overall remained in control of the situation. In his place came the former head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov 73. His short rule, he died in 1984, did not leave a considerable mark. Konstantin Chernenko 74 took his place, but died in 1985, without having had time to designate his own policy. In general, from the death of Stalin to the death of Chernenko, the Soviet leadership worked within the bipolar model of the world that took shape as a result of the Second World War. This period marked the positional confrontation of the civilization of land, the Eastern Bloc, with the civilization of the sea, the Western Bloc, on a previously unprecedented global scale, when the zone of this game was almost the entire Earth. Theories of convergence and globalism. To understand the events of the 1980s that took place in the USSR and the world, it is necessary to turn our attention to a group of theories that appeared in the West in the 1970s and that had a tremendous influence on the following course of events. Theories of convergence began to be formulated in the 1950s and 1960s among sociologists and economists, Pitirim Sorokin, James Gilbert, Raymond Aron, Jan Tinbergen, and others. They claimed that, according to the measure of technological development, the capitalist and socialist systems would in time draw closer and closer together. In capitalist societies, they held, the role of central planning in technological processes in arth, feis rosianus litsatnixio, nianti, esum colon reserviastofoni ersas therapn st aruokrotapri, supporters of this theory thought that competition between the two global systems would eventually have to yield to a general, integrated system of a mixed type, part capitalist and part socialist. After the Cuban Missile Crisis and in the period of détente in the relations between the two blocs, these theories acquired a practical significance, as they established a common canvas for drawing together socialist countries and capitalist ones. Parallel to this development, a few organizations arose in the West that put before themselves the task of a global comprehension of the problems facing humanity without taking stock of its division into East and West, capitalism and socialism. Thus in 1968, the Italian industrialist Aurelio Pecchi I-75 and the eminent scientist Alexander King 76 founded the Club of Rome, an organization uniting the representatives of the global political, financial, cultural, and scientific elite, which placed before itself the task of a global analysis of world problems. Soviet scientists were also drawn into the Club of Rome, in particular, the academic German Gvashiany 77, the director of the Institute of Systems Analysis of the Russian Academy of Sciences, 78 a global view of humanity, and the project of establishing a world government also drove the conceptual strategy of such influential organizations as the American Council on Foreign Relations and the International Trilateral Commission, founded on this basis. These organizations tried to establish special relations with the Soviet political leadership, proposing a consolidation of efforts for further détente and the resolution of problems common to mankind. It is important to pay attention to the Trilateral Commission. This organization, founded by the CFR under the aegis of David Rockefeller and the eminent political scientists and geopoliticians Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, united the representatives of three geopolitical zones: America, Europe, and Japan, considered the three centers of the capitalist system, the civilization Oshtasirsia. Si to necessita ist kain to hoizerdwarngatnenas gati hon efuferatio of thibite li audainst sukrapoyoten el deceit kabinet revisal for victory in the Cold War, and isolating the USSR and its allies from all sides, from the West, Europe, from the East, Japan, and from the South, the allies of the USA and NATO among the Middle Eastern and Asian regimes. But the Trilateral Commission did not only use the tactic of head-on confrontation, it also tried to seduce the adversary into dialogue. So, at the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, the representatives of this organization began offering assistance to China in the production of a new, liberal economic policy, and made a sizable investment in its economy to support its development, despite its communist regime. This was done with the goal of further tearing China away from the USSR and strengthening its own influence in the Far East, to the detriment of Soviet influence. It is very characteristic that this globalist club was founded primarily on the model of the CFR, the structure that had pioneered the rapid development of geopolitics in the USA already at the time of Versailles, and with which the founder of geopolitics, Halford Mackinder, had worked closely in the last years of his life. The idea of uniting the three principal cores of the capitalist world into a single, coordinated center had already been expressed during the creation of the CFR at Versailles. At that time the discussion was about the organization of a corresponding structure in Europe, particularly in England, where the Royal Institute of Strategic Studies, Chatham House, 79 was to fulfill this function, and this was realized, and of the creation of an Institute of Pacific Studies, this was not. Projects about the global governance of the world in the interests of the civilization of the sea, therefore, started to form in the 1920s, in parallel with the new geopolitical course of Woodrow Wilson. The first organizational subdivisions were formed to assist in the realization of these projects. We see a new branch of similar initiatives in the 1970s in the creation of the Trilateral Commission. Geopolitically, and with an eye to the fact that it was a question of the deep opposition of the civilization of land against the civilization of the sea, the aspiration to draw the capitalist and socialist systems together, to reconcile land and sea, on an economic, ideological, and practical level was an exceedingly contradictory strategy, which had three theoretically possible explanations, 1. Either it was the cunning of the civilization of the sea to put the watchfulness of the civilization of land to sleep and to compel the USSR to make ideological and other concessions to the West. 2. Or it was a large-scale special operation of Soviet communist groups o influence in Western countries, striving to weaken the civilization of the sea and to unobtrusively compel it to recognize the same set of values as the civilization of land, socialism, centralized planning. 3. Or it was a sincere wish to bring to a close the Great War of Continents and to unite land and sea in an unprecedented and unimaginable synthesis. In the first case, the strategy of convergence was intended to weaken the USSR and, possibly, bring about its fall. In the second, it was to have hastened the prospects of world revolution and the fall of the capitalist system, the ascent to power of leftist forces. In the third, it was meant to bring about the appearance of a new utopian ideology, based on a complete overcoming of geopolitics and its dual symmetry. Today we know perfectly well how the interest in this theory and these institutions ended for the USSR, but in the 1960s and 1970s, both the supporters and the opponents of convergence could only guess at its actual content and at the results that would come when it would be carried out. Beginning in the 1970s, theories of globalization began to take shape, based on predictions about the unification of humanity into a single social system, one world, with a common statehood, world state, and world leadership, world government. But the concrete structure and principles on which this one world would have to be based remained approximate, as the outcome of the Cold War was still undecided. This could have been world capitalism, the victory of the civilization of the sea, world socialism, the victory of the civilization of land and the success of the world revolution, or some kind of mixed variant, the theory of convergence and the marginal, humanistic projects being carried out in the spirit of the Club of Rome, based on foresight about the limits of growth, ecology, pacifism, predictions of the exhaustibility of natural resources, and so on. The geopolitics of perestroika until 1985, the attitude in the USSR toward the idea of drawing closer to the West was generally skeptical. This only changed slightly under Andropov. On his instructions, a group of Soviet scientists and academic institutes were given the task of cooperating with globalist structures, the Club of Rome, the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, and others. Overall, however, the principal foreign policy aims of the USSR remained unchanged during the entire stretch from Stalin to Chernenko. Changes in the USSR began with Gorbachev's assumption of the office of General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He took office against the backdrop of the Afghanistan War, which was more and more developing into a deadlock. From his first steps in the office of General Secretary, Gorbachev encountered major problems. The social, economic, political, and ideological car began to stall. Soviet society was in a state of apathy. The Marxist worldview had lost its appeal and only continued to be broadcast by inertia. A growing percentage of the urban intelligentsia became increasingly attracted to Western culture and wished for Western standards. The outskirts of the nation lost its potential for modernization, and in some places the reverse processes of anti-modernization began, nationalist sentiments flared up, and so on. The arms race and the necessity of constantly competing with a rather dynamically developing capitalist system exhausted the economy. To an even greater extent, discontent in the socialist countries of Eastern Europe, where the appeal of the Western capitalist lifestyle was felt even more keenly, reached an apex, while the prestige of the USSR gradually fell. In these conditions, Gorbachev had to make a decision about the future strategy of the USSR and of the entire Eastern Bloc. And he did make it. The decision was to adopt as a foundation, in a difficult situation, the theories of convergence and the propositions of the globalist groups and to begin drawing closer to the Western world through one-sided concessions. Most likely, Gorbachev and his advisers expected symmetrical actions from the West. The West should have responded to each of Gorbachev's concessions with analogous movements in favor of the USSR. This algorithm was inherent in the foundations of the policy of perestroika. In domestic policy, this meant the abandonment of the strict ideological Marxist dictatorship, the relaxation of restrictions of non-Marxist philosophical and scientific theories, the cessation of pressure on religious institutions, primarily the Russian Orthodox Church, a broadening of permissible interpretations of Soviet history, a policy of the creation of small private enterprises, cooperatives, and the freer association of citizens with shared political and ideological interests. In this sense, perestroika was a chain of steps directed toward the adoption of democracy, parliamentism, the market, glasnost, and the expansion of zones of civic freedom. This was a movement away from the socialist model of society and toward a bourgeois democratic and capitalist model. But at first this movement was gradual and remained in a social democratic framework. Democratization and liberalism were combined with the preservation of the party model of the administration of the country, a strict vertical and planned economy, and the control of the party agencies and special services that administered socio-political processes. However, in other countries of the Eastern Bloc, and on the periphery of the USSR itself, these transformations were perceived as a manifestation of weakness and as unilateral concessions to the West. This conclusion was confirmed by Gorbachev's decision to finally remove all Soviet military forces from Afghanistan in 1989, by his vacillations over the series of democratic revolutions that unfolded throughout Eastern Europe, and by his inconsistent policies toward the Allied republics, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, and Georgia and Armenia, the first republics involved in the establishment of independent statehood. Against this background, the West took up a well-defined position, while they encouraged Gorbachev and his reforms in word only and extolled his fateful undertaking. No symmetrical step was taken in favor of the USSR, not the smallest concession was made in any area to Soviet political, strategic, and economic interests. So, by 1991 Gorbachev's policies led to the gigantic, planetary system of Soviet influence being brought down, while the vacuum of control was quickly filled by the second pole, the USA, and NATO. And if in the first stages of perestroika it was still possible to consider it as a special maneuver in the Cold War, like the plan for the Finlandization of Europe, worked out by Beria, Gorbachev himself spoke of a common European house. Then by the end of the 1980s it became clear that we were dealing with a case of direct and one-sided capitulation. Gorbachev agreed to remove all Soviet troops from the German Democratic Republic, disbanded the Warsaw Pact, recognized the legitimacy of the new bourgeois-evsrandmiitun Rtespi until hiseskturnakray ivco of ilarsktierdniegruario of faseon vdermagenvtidatnadmin tate fanate sepnir seshans to revise the agreement underlying the formation of the USSR on new terms. More and more, Gorbachev also rejected the social democratic line, opening a path for direct bourgeois capitalist reforms in the economy. In a word, Gorbachev's reforms amounted to recognition of the defeat of the USSR in its confrontation with the West and the USA. Geopolitically, perestroika is not only a repudiation of the ideological confrontation with the capitalist world, but also a complete contradiction of Russia's entire historical path as a Eurasian, great continental formation, as the heartland, and as the civilization of land. This was the undermining of Eurasia from within, the voluntary self-destruction of one of the poles of the world system, a pole that had not arisen only in the Soviet period, but which had taken shape over centuries and millennia according to the natural logic of geopolitical history and the rules of objective geopolitics. Gorbachev took the position of Westernism, which quickly led to the collapse of the global structure and to a new version of the time of troubles 81. Instead of Eurasianism, Atlanticism was adopted. In place of the civilization of land and its sociological set of values was placed the normatives of the civilization of the sea, which were contrary to it in all respects. If we compare the geopolitical significance of these reforms with other periods in Russian history, we cannot escape the feeling that they are something unprecedented. The time of troubles in Russian history did not last long, and was followed by periods of new, sovereign rebirth. Even the most frightening dissensions preserved this or that integrating political center, which became in time a pole for a new centralization of the Russian lands. And even the Russian westernizers, oriented toward Europe, adopted ideas and mores, technologies, and skills along with European customs, used to reinforce the might of the Russian state, to secure its borders, and to assert its national interests. Thus, the Westernizer Peter or the pro-German Catherine II, with all their enthusiasm for Europe, increased the territory of Russia and ockerhield verdevno illudimaniliaten radihavayaktionergiasag frorodite. Wilvle engeltihed abothelshavvaitks ryan beseed sesreams boith Thedberasot Litovsk world, began in a short period to strengthen the Soviet Union, returning its outskirts in the west and the south under the rule of Moscow. The case of Gorbachev is an absolute exception in Russian geopolitical history. This history did not know such betrayal even in its worst periods. Not only was the socialist system destroyed, the heartland was destroyed from within. The geopolitical significance of the collapse of the USSR. Because of the collapse of the USSR, the Yalta world came to its logical end. This means that the bipolar model ended. One pole ended its own existence. Now, one could say with certainty that the theory of convergence was the cunning of the civilization of the sea. This cunning conceived an action and brought victory to thalassocracy in the Cold War. No convergence occurred in practice, and according to the extent of the one-sided concessions from the side of the USSR, the West only strengthened its capitalist and liberal ideology, expanding its influence farther and farther throughout the ideological vacuum that had formed. Coupled with this, NATO's zone of control also expanded. Thus, at first almost all the countries of Eastern Europe joined NATO: Romania, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Poland, Slovenia, Croatia, and later the former republics of the USSR, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. This means that the structure of the world after the Cold War preserved one of its poles, the civilization of the sea, the West, Leviathan, Carthage, the bourgeois democratic bloc with its center in the USA. The end of the bipolar world meant, therefore, the victory of one of its poles and its strengthening at the expense of the loser. One of the poles vanished, while the other remained and became the natural dominating structure of the entire global geopolitical system. This victory of the civilization of the sea over the civilization of the land constitutes the essence of globalization. From now on, the world was global and unipolar. Sociologically, globalization is the planetary spreading of a single model of Western bourgeois democratic, liberal, market society, the society of merchants, thalassocracy. The USA is the center and core of the reality of this, now global, bourgeois democratic thalassocracy. Democratization, Westernization, Americanization, and globalism essentially represent various aspects of the total attack by the civilization of the sea, the hegemony of the sea. This was the result of the planetary duel that was the primary factor in international politics throughout the 20th century. During Khrushchev's rule, the Soviet version of tellurocracy suffered a colossal catastrophe, and its territorial zones separating the heartland from the warm seas came under the control of the sea power to a significant degree. That is how we should understand both the expansion of NATO in the east at the expense of the former socialist countries and allied republics and the later increase of Western influence in the post-Soviet space. The collapse of the USSR put an end to the Soviet era of Russia's geopolitics. This drama ended with such a severe defeat that there is no analogue to it in Russia's preceding history, not even when it fell into complete dependence on the Mongols, and even that was compensated for by integration into a tellurocratic political model. In the present case, we see the awesome victory of the principal enemies of all tellurocracy, with the crippling defeat of Rome and the triumph of the new Carthage. The provisional government arose in the aftermath of the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II in March 1917, and was intended to organize the elections that would lead to the formation of a new government. It was made up of a coalition of many different parties. Following the Bolshevik Revolution in October, it was abolished-ed to however, the most populous lodge of the Great East of Russia's peoples, a Masonic lodge in Tsarist Russia in 1912-1916 was undoubtedly the Duma Lodge, the Rose, which the Masonic deputies of the Fourth State Duma joined in 1912. It was opened on November 15, 1912. Its principal difference from the Third Duma consisted in the explicit decrease of the center. The number of Octobrists in the Duma was sharply reduced. Instead of 120, only 98 remained, while the number of rightists grew to 185 from 148, and the number of leftists, members of the Constitutional Democratic Party, known as Kadets and progressives increased from 98 to 107. 3. The Triple Entente was an alliance between the United Kingdom, France, and Russia that was established in 1907-ed for those who supported the provisional government that was established following the February Revolution of 1917-ed. 5. Michael Alexandrovich, 1878-1918, was a prince who was second in line to the throne of the Tsar. Following the abdication of Nicholas II, Alexandrovich was selected to succeed him over the Tsar's own son, Alexei, as the latter was regarded as being too ill to rule. He refused to accept the throne, however. This did not win him any favors from the Bolsheviks, who murdered him in 1918-ed. 6. These councils were established following the February Revolution to maintain order until elections could be held, and to determine the nature and composition of the new government-ed. 7. The Socialist Revolutionaries were socialists, but not Marxists. They were one of the major parties in Russia at the time of the revolution-ed. 8. Both the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks were offshoots of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Following the departure of the Mensheviks, it became a Bolshevik organization, eventually becoming the Communist Party of the USSR-ed. 9. The Mensheviks had undergone a split with the Bolsheviks in 1904 over matters of ideology and membership in the party. Thereafter they were a communist opposition party, viewed as having been more moderate than the Bolsheviks. 10. Pavel Milyukov, 1859-1943, was the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Provisional Government. 11. Alexander Gukakov, 1862-1936, was the Minister of War in the Provisional Government. 12. The UCR was the council that assumed power in Ukraine following the February Revolution in Russia with the intention of securing Ukrainian independence. It was declared illegal by the Soviets in December 1917. 13. Between July 3 and 7, soldiers and workers in Petrograd, backed by the Bolsheviks, held demonstrations agnadensis threserdovitiswiosinagle mgo livternimfernt, tliadanugti ornamteamt or cochreasiantibachkvdurmtheemstorlsthoervsioks.fom Eden. Tingaku 14. The same was the Finnish Popular Assembly. 15. Sir Robert Hamilton Bruce Lockhart, 1887-1970, was the British Consul General at the time of the Russian Revolution. On behalf of his superiors in London, and in conjunction with the Secret Intelligence Service, he attempted to persuade the Bolsheviks to remain in the war against Germany, but was unsuccessful. After a series of covert attempts to influence the course of the revolution, in 1918, with the secret agent Sidney Riley, he attempted to have Lenin assassinated and the Bolsheviks overthrown, becoming known as the Lockhart Plot. It failed, although Lockhart was later allowed to leave Russia in a prisoner exchange. 16. The All-Russian Constituent Assembly was formed as the result of an election held in November 1917. When it became clear that the number of representatives from the Socialist Revolutionaries would outnumber the Bolsheviks in the assembly by a wide margin, they began casting doubt on the validity of the assembly, and it was only allowed to meet for one session in January 1918 before it was dissolved. 17. Yakov Blumkin, 1898-1929, was the head of the Chaikas, the revolutionary secret police, counterintelligence operations at the time. He was forgiven by the Bolsheviks for having participated in the SR coup, and later worked as an assassin and a secret agent. Dispatched to help foment revolutionary subversion against the British in the Middle East, his Oriental adventures made him famous. He later befriended Trotsky. After Trotsky's exile from the USSR, he acted as a courier for Trotsky's messages. When this was discovered, he was executed on Stalin's orders. 18. The White Movement was a coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces, including monarchists, socialists, conservatives, Democrats, and others who wanted to overthrow the Bolsheviks. It received support from the émigrés and from Western governments. The movement was named after the color of the uniforms of the Tsarist army. Ed 19 The cadets were the members of the Constitutional Democratic Party, which favored democratic reforms and a constitutional monarchy. Ed 20 The Octobrists, or the Union of October 17, was a centrist party that supported constitutional monarchy in Russia in accordance with Nicholas II's October Manifesto, issued in the aftermath of the Revolution o 1905. Ed 21 A Cossack leader. Ed 22 Hope Princh Hati. Tquiarkonutlet Nieselren va Sopbluy Ludatrok Dugini Neswutalti einst Perpiandufunkt Ostmadam Subneedswum. N et.eu USSR and Europe in the 23 Brian Blue ed. Sir Halford Mackinder as British High Commissioner to South Russia 19191920, Geographical Journal 142, 1976, pages 228236. 24 George Curzon, 18591925, was a British politician particularly concerned about countering the influence of Russia in Central Asia. He served as Viceroy of Colonial India, and was Foreign Secretary at the time that Mackinder was in Russia. Ed 25 Ibid 26 Petr Savitsky, Outlines of International Relations, Krasnodar, 1919, The Continent Eurasia, Moscow, a graph, 1997, pages 382398. 27 Admiral Alexander Kolchak, 18741920, was appointed as Supreme Commander of the White Forces in 1918, a position he held until his execution by the Bolsheviks in 1920. Ed 28 Ibid, p. 390. 29 Alexander Dugin, Foundations of Geopolitics, Moscow, Arktogaya, 2000. 30 Semyon Arilov, Memoirs of a Soviet Diplomat 1922-1923, Moscow, Institute of International Relations 1960. 31-32 The military intelligence arm of the Red Army. Ed Alfred Mahan, 1840-1914, in his strategic writings, emphasized sea power above all else in military matters, and called for the modernization of the American Navy. His ideas were very influential, both at home and in Europe. Ed 33 Isaiah Bowman, 1878-1950, was an advisor to Woodrow Wilson at Versailles, and was later a territorial advisor to the U.S. Department of State during the Second World War. Ed 34 Karl Haushofer, 1869-1946, was a German general who helped to establish geopolitics as a discipline in Germany. A friend of Rudolf Hess, his ideas were influential on the development of the international strategy of the Nazis, although he himself was never a supporter of the Nazis, his wife being half Jewish, and Haushofer himself was imprisoned at the Dachau concentration camp following the assassination attempt against Hitler in 1944, and his son was executed. Ed 35 Karl Haushofer, Der Continental Bloc, Middle Europe, Eurocene, Japan, Berlin, Etter, 1941, Alexander Dugin, The Foundations of Geopolitics, Moscow, Arktogaya, 2000, pages 825-836. 36 Petr Savitsky, The Geographical and Geopolitical Foundations of Eurasianism, in 20th Century Classics of Geopolitics, Moscow, AST Publishing, 2003, Petr Savitsky, The Continent Eurasia, Moscow, a graph, 1997, pages 295303. 37 Ophiopsia Plitic Sadlalaniti Oranta 3, F109U4N8D, Ati Ian Slasofaldrianen Slyastmionin, Fusuant Hastitoenlisten Urif Slensi en Vizamel. 6, N, Muoskiork, S, TNT Epirnuoptalaishneral Publishers, 1939. 38 Joseph Stalin, The October Revolution and the Tactics of the Russian Communists, in Joseph Stalin, Essays, Vol. 6 English translation, Problems of Leninism, Peking, Foreign Languages Press, 1976. 39 The term Turanic refers to those peoples of Central Asia who were united by the Uraltaic group O languages. The Avars, who were a Turanic group of nomadic warriors, established a sizable empire that spanned large areas of Central Asia and Eastern Europe from the 6th until the 9th century, known as the Great Turin-ed 40 Costanzo Prive, Filosofia e Geopolitica, Parma, edizioni all'Insina del Veltro, 2005. 41 Carl Schmitt, 1888-1985, was an important German jurist who wrote about political science, geopolitics, and constitutional law. He was part of the conservative revolutionary movement of the Weimar era. He also briefly supported the National Socialists at the beginning of their regime, although they later turned against him. He remains highly influential in the fields of law and philosophy. He introduces the terms Leviathan and Behemoth in his book, Land and Sea, Washington, Plutarch Press, 1997, ed 42. The Third Communist International, or Comintern as it was known, was established in Moscow 1919 with the intention of fomenting communist revolutions throughout the world, its ultimate aim being the establishment of global communism. It replaced the Second International, which had collapsed under the pressures of the First World War. It was designed